From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Morning Line with Nick Beres.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. Nick Beres here on a Monday. I hope you had a good weekend. Boy, that was great weather this past weekend. Talking about weather, that kind of will segue into our program this morning. One way or the other, we see the world around us changing. And the question of climate, we can talk about global warming, or we can just talk also about, the flooding, the heat waves, everything we see. Tying in with the fact that we're just kind of still dealing with the tail end of what was just a devastating pandemic with COVID. And the question moving forward, what role does climate maybe have on disease, illness, and whether or not you or I get sick moving forward, and how the world changes around us? We're going to kind of get into that this morning. We're thinking, well, that's an interesting topic. There have been some news stories on it. Can we get someone locally to talk about it? Well, yeah, there's always experts, very good ones at Vanderbilt, and we're going to talk about it with Carol Ziegler's with us this morning. Good morning, Carol.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. You are with, is it the Global Health and Family Institute, or Institute of Global Health and
There's
Family?
the Vanderbilt Institute for Global Health and the School of Nursing.
And the School of Nursing. Okay.
Yes.
Are you a nurse?
I am. I'm a family nurse practitioner.
All right.
Yes.
Well, all right. Climate hazards. We were talking when we first sat down just about, how Nashville in some ways recently could be an example of kind of what we're talking about. And we had to start the show, and I'm going to let you pick up what we were talking about beforehand. How was Nashville maybe a good example of what we will elaborate on today?
So we think about climate change as a threat multiplier, essentially, right? So if we think back to our city in March of 2020, we had the tornado come through, which was devastating, right? Especially for North and East Nashville. And so a lot of families, there were individuals that lost their lives, unfortunately. There were a lot of homes that were damaged. We lost power, right? And infrastructure was damaged. And then we had, which as a nurse, it was exciting to see all these people came from all over to help, right? So I was at one of the staging, there was a church that was a staging center to help get people supplies. And there were hundreds of people coming from across the country who would just come through airports, right? And this is right when COVID also kicked off. So we had all these people sort of in close proximity, sort of as yet unaware of what was coming. At the same time, we had leadership changes at the health department. If we think about then, right, so there was the tornado, then many schools were closed because of damage. Then spring break, and then COVID really kicked off. And so
God, it was just,
kids never went back to school.
I've forgotten how it was just one thing after another. All right, so okay, because of all of this happening at once, what are you saying?
So many things. So one thing is obviously the direct impact. So climate change can impact human beings directly, right? Either from heat, so people can die from heat stroke or heat-related illness, and then also from extreme weather. So some individuals did lose their lives just because of the tornado itself, right? And then on top of that, so for example, I'm a family nurse practitioner. I was practicing at Beres at the time in North Nashville. A lot of patients couldn't access their medication just because they couldn't get out of their homes, right? So people who are diabetic, who need inhalers, who have heart failure, are not able to get to their pharmacies, get to their provider to access their medications. Folks that don't have climate control, so air conditioning and heat during those times, if you already have a comorbid condition like diabetes, heart failure, hypertension, and your climate is in control, that can be really, really stressful on you. And then families lost their homes. So it's sort of the primary direct impact, the secondary impact, which can make existing illnesses worse, and the stress of that, and then also the tertiary impacts of just the changes it's made even in our community generally.
Okay, now what you just described there is something that has always happened whenever there is some kind of weather disaster going back years. I guess the point is that we're seeing more extreme weather now than ever before, so we're going to see these types of problems surface more frequently. Is that it? Because I mean, when I was a child, I still remember a tornado going through when I grew up in Illinois, and some of the same types of things happened, didn't coincide with a pandemic. But what is different now than, because what you just described there has been around forever, where we have devastating times dealing with natural disasters?
So the tornado we just had in Nashville, the 2020 tornado was the costliest we've had so far. So just the devastation that it caused.
So it's more severe weather than ever before, and it's hitting more frequently.
Yes, that's correct. And then if you think about just the last month, the heat wave that we experienced, and this was now global, so even in Europe, right, across the world, we've seen these heat waves that we weren't really expecting until about 2050. So the temperatures are higher and they're lasting longer than we expect them to, and that is really devastating on families without air conditioning, so low-income families. If you think about people that work outdoors, so about 30% of our workforce in Nashville are people that are employed in high-risk sectors. So think about first responders, police officers, construction workers, all the construction happening in the city, right? Agriculture workers. even children in camps, coaches, anyone who's outdoors and exposed is really at risk from heat.
All right, so that's the climate, the heat, and all of that. Now that plays a role. I was looking at some of the information coming up. Just CBS did a story on this, I think, last week. Researchers looked through the medical literature of established cases of illnesses and found that 218 out of the known 375 human infectious diseases, I didn't know, I thought there were more than that, or 85% of them seem to be made worse by one of 10 types of extreme weather connected with climate change.
Yeah.
Okay, and when they say worse, what does that mean? I mean, that part of it really is kind of what fascinates and frightens me a bit. For some reason in my mind, I think, okay, yeah, a tornado comes and it's going to tear down buildings. It's devastating. That's hard. But I understand that. What I fear is that as we see things getting warmer and all of this, that we're going to see new types of strains of disease, like COVID that we're learning about, or like monkeypox of late, or something else that are going to surface. Are those related to climate changes?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways that can happen. One way is, I don't know, I'm from Nashville, and I never used to see armadillos.
Yeah, right. Yeah, me either.
So now we're seeing, so an armadillo is a vector, right, for the bacteria that causes leprosy, the disease we know as leprosy. So there's increasing vector range, right? So as our, even just in Nashville, as our temperature is warm, vectors can come here that couldn't come here before. They have an increased range. A vector being,
well, as you said, an armadillo, a carrier or a ground zero point. Armadillos have that bacteria on them.
Yes. So think about ticks, mosquitoes, right? They're vectors of illness. So for example, mosquitoes now, they have a longer breeding season than they had before. They're not getting killed off in the winter if the winters aren't as cold. And then another way that it impacts is, say, when we have droughts or flooding, especially when there's droughts, say, wildlife, birds, also insects will sort of congregate in one pool of water because there's less sources of water. So there's just lots of ways that this sort of changing climate can really exacerbate existing illnesses.
So is it kind of like, yeah, that's interesting. It stays warmer longer. You'll have maybe less fresh water, more pools of stagnant water, more of these insects congregating together. And I just have this vision in my head of a stew of germs commingling, and who knows what the heck emerges out of that. How does something like that then emerge and get into the human population? I guess a mosquito bites you?
A mosquito bites you. We also have, so with increasing development and increased urbanization, so as people move from rural areas into more urban areas, there's more of us together, right, living sort of on top of each other. And so we have more people together than to be hosts for different illnesses and sort of spread those things around.
It is. It's Nashville, have you traveled lately? How long have you lived in? You live in East Nashville, I guess?
I live in East Nashville,
How long have you lived in this city?
My whole life.
Okay,
I mean, I've had moments where I've been back and forth, but I'm from here, yes.
Okay, I've been around, and certainly you've traveled. Now, I've lived here over really the past 20 years or so that we've seen enormous growth. But I mean, there are so many, it's an exciting place to live, but there's so many people. I've been to some areas recently, actually, where for whatever reason the population is not as dense. There's not as much traffic. You have space around you. There's almost something that is comforting about that, whereas here it's more excitement, but people just on top of you.
Well, and that's what you bring up about having green space is really interesting, because there's a lot of research that shows that access to green space, access to forest is really beneficial for human beings. So it helps with things like hypertension. It just helps you kind of de-stress and calm down. And one of the solutions, so the researchers in this paper you mentioned, they kind of concluded that there's so many pathways that climate change impacts vectors. What we need to focus on is decreasing carbon emissions. That's the best way to get at this. And there's two ways to sort of get greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. One is to decrease emissions. The other is to increase the carbon sinks, or the bodies we have that sort of suck up the CO2.
Okay, so more trees.
Absolutely, green space helps with that.
Green space, and you see a lot of city leaders and cities across the country, including here, try to pay attention to leaving parks and setting up, and we have some lovely ones here in Middle Tennessee, but you just worry about growth and development. Heck, if Teddy Roosevelt hadn't been smart enough to set aside that land for the Smokies, as well as I do, Gatlinburg would be everywhere there, and it would be flat out disgusting. Okay, absolutely. Gatlinburg's fine where it's at, fine. But can you imagine if there weren't limits on that and that wasn't a federal park, what would have happened to the Smokies?
Yes,
because you're going to build through it. So you need to set aside and protect some green space.
Absolutely.
Okay, not just because it's pretty and it's a nice place to hike, but because it really plays an important role in keeping us healthy.
It does, absolutely. And if you think about, so I like to think, when I talk to elementary age children, I like to talk to them about, if you think of trees as an extension of your lungs, essentially, right? So they're really vital. And the more we sort of pave, and there's sort of two impacts. So one is when we remove the trees, we lose that function. And then when we pave it, right, with black asphalt, we're actually contributing to heating up the planet.
Yeah, and we're destroying floodplains and all other kind of stuff. And flooding is another part we can talk about as well, and the disease that comes with that and the aftermath. To me, there's tornadoes. I've covered horrible fires, tornadoes, earthquakes. The worst of the worst is floods, in my opinion. The overall damage. I'm not saying necessarily more fatalities always, even though that could be the case. But the most devastating natural disaster of all is a flood, because, well, we'll talk more about that and why we're seeing more of that as well. You know, when it rains here, you don't get sprinkles, so you get pounding downpours all at once, and then it goes away, but you'll get 3 inches in 2 hours.
Yes.
And that's a problem. We'll take a break. If you're on hold, Wilma and others will get to you. If you have questions, just about climate, and we're not getting so much into the climate change aspect of discussing it, but how the different weather we're seeing now affects us in terms of disease and health and all of that. More with our guest right after this. Stay with us.